you just acknowledged that what you care about are the outcomes, right? You said that that is the be-all end-all based on that hypothetical. That's what I care about too. I care about the people dying every day from cardiovascular disease, cancer, and so on. I care about, at the end of the day, is this going to help people prevent falling on their face from a heart attack? That's what I care about, and I've provided evidence showing that that swap from red meat to plant protein is a beneficial one, and I haven't seen any argument against the data I've provided. And as far as anecdotes, like, look, we can tell people to smoke and they improve Parkinson's disease, ulcerative colitis risk. It doesn't mean that it's good long-term. These patients haven't been followed long-term to see if they've developed diseases that take 40, 50, 60 years to occur. And that's what I'm worried about, is that people are going to adopt these sorts of dietary practices and run into issues way down the line, like I've shown, even in those ancestral populations.
Long-term perspective study with 400,000 people in the UK, and they found that accounting for confounding factors, socioeconomic factors, healthy user bias, that this actually eliminated the benefits associated with plant-based diet. So they looked at whole food plants, cooked and raw. They found that raw conferred a better cardiovascular benefit than cooked. Cooked didn't show any. But when you accounted for the confounding factors, that this was eliminated as well.
Yeah, just on the study, do you mind scrolling down to table 2 for a sec?
Sure.
That's a figure. I mean, table 2 should be just below that, I think. So this is the paper, right? So I just want to address.
It's really difficult to make comparisons.
So I just want to address something though. So you said that this study found no benefit, right?
No.
After adjusting for confounders.
Yeah. So it found really no benefit with cooked vegetables. It found a benefit with uncooked, but it thought that there was probably confounders that were getting in the way of that. So again, it's not a perfect study.
Sorry, can I just show what I wanted to show, please? Yeah. So this is table 2. This is what I was trying to get you to go to. If we look at all-cause mortality, cooked vegetables were beneficial, 19% lower risk of all-cause mortality in the fully adjusted model. So that is when you're adjusting for all the confounders, including BMI and whatnot. So it actually was beneficial, as was raw, very similarly beneficial, as was total vegetable intake. So I'm just confused as to why you said there was no benefit.
On the cardiovascular risk. And they found that accounting for confounding factors, socioeconomic factors, healthy user bias, that this actually eliminated the benefits associated with plant-based diet.
That is flat out wrong, and I have just shown that. Is that fair?
I was wrong about that.
Okay, so we'll get to other points because you were wrong about many other things as well.
Yeah, but for all-cause mortality, are we in agreement that there was benefit? And this is only for over 4 tablespoons of vegetable intake.
Oh yeah, no. I was speaking specifically about cardiovascular risk.
That is flat out wrong, and I have just shown that.
Okay, I just want to make clear, for all-cause mortality, we agree there was benefit. Mm-hmm. Okay. Another thing you mentioned was this one, right? The Harvard Carnivore study, right? Yeah, and so what happened to the coronary artery calcium scores in people who had scans before and after adopting carnivore?
Yeah, so the thing is, again,
I'm just asking, but I understand. I just want to point out, right, like I don't see how, what the purpose of citing this study is if we're just accepting certain findings but not others, right? Like coronary artery calcium for people who had pre-diet scores was 55. For those who also had the post-diet was 81, right? We actually saw an increase in coronary artery calcium. So here's the coronary artery. We have 55 here. We have 81 post or current. So pre-diet was 55. And so we actually see a progression of coronary artery calcium in these like self-selected carnivores through like the World Carnivore Tribe and the Carnivore Reddit and all of that, presumably who are very strong proponents of that, right? It's imagine if I were to go on my social media and say, hey, let's survey a bunch of vegans about their health. Obviously, there would be a selection bias. So I just think this is a really pretty terrible study, actually, if I'm honest about that. And like you said, we're only looking at replacing the standard American diet. That's actually not true. We have substitution analyses that specifically model the replacement of red meat and specifically unprocessed red meat and plant protein sources. So here, we actually other animal protein sources as well, replacing unprocessed red meat with, in this case it was dairy, nuts, or legumes was beneficial for cardiovascular disease, a meta-analysis of prospective cohorts there. And in this study by Huang et al., this was the NIH AARP study published back in 2020, replacement of just 3% of calories from red meat protein with plant protein was associated with a 13% lower risk of all-cause mortality in men and a 15% lower risk of all-cause mortality in women. And this is the adjustment model if there were any concerns. If anything, I'd say they over-adjusted. But a very, very comprehensive adjustment model. And this is specifically looking at that replacement, right? If we took people and they were to swap out a bit of the red meat they're eating with some plant protein sources, they end up, living longer and having a lower risk of disease. So it's not just this idea of replacing the standard American diet. And then the last thing I'll mention really quick about zoo animals. So are you suggesting that the zoo animals don't get disease in the wild or in zoos because they're fed their species appropriate diet, or just wondering about that?
Disease insofar as getting infections, but they don't get diabetes and autoimmune disorders.
What about
when they're
cancers, cardiovascular disease?
No, not really. It's much lower. And
so actually, let's look at that too really quick here. Look at cancer risk amongst mammals or across mammals, and these are in zoos, being fed their presumably species-specific diet, as you put it. 110,000 animals.
Does it say that specifically?
Yeah, so they talk about meat in particular, like meat intake amongst the carnivores, and I'll tell you why. I'm going to get to that in a second here. So if we look at the different types of animals too, we actually see that the cancer rates are the highest amongst carnivores, even though they're eating this meat, raw meat largely. The herbivores primates have a lower rates of cancer mortality. We look at rodents, lower rates of cancer mortality. It's spiking up like crazy here, and we can see the means on the cancer mortality rate, right here on the right side. So these animals absolutely do get cancer.
Would you admit that you were wrong?
I missed that.
Okay. 3 times wrong.
So these diseases do exist in the wild and in zoos where they're presumably being fed appropriately. As you said, you're not supposed to feed animals because they have very specific diets that they're adhering to. So I just don't see any bearing on this idea that, animals don't get the disease if they're eating according to their quote-unquote species-specific diet. And at the end of the day, this all comes back to outcomes. Like I said, replacing animal protein, red meat protein in particular, with plant protein sources has consistently been shown to lead to lower mortality risk, lower cardiovascular disease risk in virtually every cohort that there has been looking at that. NIH, AARP, Nurses Health, Health Professionals Follow-Up, JPHC. The Rotterdam study was actually carbs for animal protein, and the list goes on and on. So what I'd be really interested to hear is, what is the fundamental issue that applies to those studies, even though they're done in different populations by different researchers using different methodologies, that would explain those results?
Do you honestly feel qualified to read even a single paper?
Yes.
But you don't know how to read a forest plot?
Now, as far as the question regarding plant-only diet, depends what you mean. If you mean plant-only, no supplementation, fortification, well then no, I'd say that's not adequate. I advocate for people to supplement appropriately. Obviously, the one that everyone is aware of is vitamin B12. And when we supplement appropriately and we look at populations who are doing that, we see that they do just fine. They have similar nutrient status and rates of deficiency to omnivorous counterparts who are eating a lot more animal products. I mean, we see this out of some research. I'll just actually share my screen again real quick. And so if you're looking at omnivore vegans on the right, similar rates of low magnesium, similar rates of low hemoglobin, plasma ferritin, similar for zinc, similar for iodine. Mind you, everybody was low in iodine, presumably not having much like iodized salt or what have you, or fish in this population, or seaweed for people eating plants. Vitamin A was similar, beta carotene, vitamin E, B2 roughly similar, B6, B12 no significant differences. Folic acid, actually the omnivores were lower in. But this all just comes back to what I was talking about before, is that if we can get all of our nutrition with a plant-based diet plus appropriate supplementation, and it leads to better health outcomes, lower rates of cancer incidence based on this meta-analysis from 2017, lower risk of ischemic heart disease based on this meta-analysis from earlier this year, vegans compared to non-vegetarians. What's the problem? Why do we need to consume a diet that doesn't come with supplementation, right? It doesn't make a lot of sense when the health outcomes are suggesting that it is healthy, and again, that's what I care about. Maybe not everybody cares about the health outcomes, but that would be my kind of position or my response to that question.
The idea that we are optimal on a diet that is lacking in basic nutrients. I don't think that follows. And you need K2. That's required, and it's actually found to be in poor dentition and jaw development if you have a lack of K2. Vitamin A in its whole form, retinol, does not exist in plants. You have to get it from the carotenoids like beta carotene. You have to eat quite a lot of these things to get enough vitamin A, sometimes as much as 6 pounds of carrots. And there are about 45% of people that are hypo metabolizers of beta carotene. So it's very difficult for them to get vitamin A as well. And then you're looking at amino acid balance and bioavailability. This again, you can get a complete protein, you certainly can, from plants, but it's not necessarily in the right proportions. And if I can find one of these studies.
While you're looking that up, do you mind if I just mention a couple things?
Sure.
Yeah, so I want to understand this idea of like, well, if you need to supplement, then the diet's inferior or not as healthy or optimal, so to speak. Let's just do a quick thought experiment. Let's say there's 2 diets, right? There's diet A, which provides everything that you need as far as essential nutrients, and then there's diet B, which provides most of what you need, but you do need to supplement a couple things. Diet B also, and let's say we didn't know this definitively, leads to better long-term health outcomes, lower risk of cardiovascular disease, cancers, all-cause mortality, etc. Which of those 2 diets would you choose?
Well, it depends on the evidence. But
well, no. For sake of the hypothetical, we have hard evidence. It meets every criteria that you need for causal inference.
But we don't, though.
No, but just hypothetically, we do. I'm trying to understand your values, right? And so, just in that hypothetical, if those are the 2 examples we have,
I don't think that follows. Because if you're biologically designed
we're going right. That's the whole. The debate is about that, right? The debate is about which is ultimately healthier. I'm just trying to understand if it were the case. If I were to show you this, would you accept that, right? So in these 2 situations, hell, they aren't even carnivore and vegan. Let's just throw those out for a second. They're unnamed diets. We know nothing about them other than what I just said. Diet A provides all of what you need, other than all of what you need as far as essential nutrients. Diet B provides most. You have to supplement a few things, but it leads to better long-term health outcomes. Which of those 2 would you say is healthier? Would you choose?
Well, I think it's still a false comparison.
No, it's really not a false. It's a hypothetical to understand your values, right? So let's just put it this way. Wait. Hold on. I'm saying the evidence.
No, I'm answering your question.
You're not answering it because
I'm trying to answer your question right now. If
you're not answering it, though.
You could show me hard evidence that I was convinced of.
And it is in this hypothetical.
I would go with the most helpful one.
Okay, so you would.
I would go with the most healthy one.
Okay, in the case that
you could do that.
Yeah. So what that tells me is that what you care about are the health outcomes over things like whether or not you need to supplement, whether or not some things are biological diet, and so on. The health outcomes are the be-all, end-all above all of that. That's what that tells me. And so that brings us back to the health outcome data. You still haven't explained why it is the case that when we substitute red meat for plant protein sources, we see improvements in outcomes. You haven't been able to critique any of those studies so far, or explain to me why it is that vegans consistently do better than people following a diet, at least closer to what you're recommending in the case of omnivorous diets, more meat and dairy and whatnot. So that's ultimately.
I don't agree with your premise. I don't agree with that underlying premise.
Well, no.
That, something that we're not biologically designed for is going to be more healthy and it's going to have better health outcomes.
But here's the thing: I've provided evidence that swap of red meat from even unprocessed red meat across different populations, different research groups. Different study designs, including long-term randomized controlled trials, leads to better outcomes long-term. And
there are other studies that say the opposite.
But hold on. I'm happy to address all of those too. But what is the fundamental issue? Like, surely you're familiar with the Nurses' Health Study or Health Professionals Follow-Up Study. What are the inherent issues with that? Or better yet, what are the inherent issues with the Lyon Diet Heart Study, long-term RCT? Can you point out specific issues with either of those? Like methods?
It's not really the point. The point is that there's countervailing arguments and there's countervailing evidence.
There's countervailing evidence for smoking too.
None of these studies are perfect.
No, I'm not saying they are.
I'm not going to have flaws.
I'm wondering, I want to know what those flaws are, because here's the thing. Those flaws need to ultimately apply to the studies I'm providing, but not to the studies that you're providing in order to demonstrate that your studies are better.
See, the thing is that I haven't said that ever.
No, I know. I'm not saying
actually disparagingly towards the studies on my side as well.
I'm not
they're
saying
not perfect. They're not good, and so that's why I said we shouldn't be looking at those studies. We should be going to first principles. What are we biologically designed to eat?
But see, I'm arguing. So again, we're going back to you just acknowledged that what you care about are the outcomes, right? You said that is the be all end all based on that hypothetical. That's what I care about too. I care about the people dying every day from cardiovascular disease, cancer, and so on. I care about, at the end of the day, is this going to help people prevent falling on their face from a heart attack? That's what I care about, and I've provided evidence showing that swap from red meat to plant protein is a beneficial one, and I haven't seen any argument against the data I've provided. That's what I want to know. Is there any flaw? Like, I've seen you say, and I can pull up the exact timestamp if you want, but I've seen you say you have to look at the methods of these studies to critique. I'm asking you just to do that, right? To just critique methodologically. Surely you're familiar with, like I said, the Nurses Health Professionals follow-up. Surely you're familiar with Leon Diet Heart, some of the most famous nutrition studies we have out there. So what are the issues with at least those? I'm not expecting you to go into everything I've presented.
Well, that's the thing. I didn't prepare for that. I haven't gone through those at the moment, so I couldn't give you a robust description of that.
But you don't know how to read a forest plot.
The thing is, we're disagreeing on the premise here.
No, we're not.
You're talking about a false premise. You're saying that
I'm not. See, that's the no. I'm not. You're assuming that the adaptations lead to the outcome, but we've already established what you care about is the outcome. I also do. I don't agree that the adaptation leads to the outcome, and I'm providing counter evidence.
Why is that? What is your biological premise for that?
Because the health outcome data clearly shows us that this approach is better long term. And in fact, I just want to point out something really quick here, because this is your lecture, right? So this is your lecture from Plants Are Trying to Kill You. If we go down to the references, we see, there's like podcasts, there's some YouTube videos and stuff, but here you say fiber causes colon disease. But when we open it up, it's a cross-sectional study of 2,000 people. Why are you using that sort of terminology for really low-quality observational research when you're discounting some of the, the Nurses Health Professionals follow-up long-term RCTs without actually providing a critique?
So, I'm using loose language. I can certainly change that because that wasn't a causal study.
Okay.
Fair enough?
Fair enough.
Got it wrong again.
But what I need to hear ultimately is a critique for any of the research I presented.
Well, I told you, if you want to do a critique sometime, we can go through it. I'm not prepared to do a critique at this point in time. I didn't receive your studies or anything like that. I couldn't go through them, and so I don't have a critique.
Yeah, and that was obviously Lauren was away, so that explains that. But anyway,
that's fine. But the thing is that you're asking me to do something that I'm not prepared for, and so obviously that's not something that I can do in a well-reasoned way.
But you don't know how to read a forest plot.
The point is that there are other studies. There are studies that go counter to what you're saying. There are studies that suggest that that vegetarians are even less healthy and have a low quality life than meat eaters. There's a study with 100.
Can you cite one, please?
Yeah. There's like something like 84% of vegans are vegetarian.
That's not true. That's actually not. No, that's based on Phonalytics.
Maybe you can.
Yeah.
No, so that. Let me finish my thought.
Yeah. Okay. Go ahead.
You can go on.
Yeah. Go ahead.
But and that's fine, because the thing is that I haven't really crunched those statistics. Those are just statistics that
it's cited often.
So I'm not. Yeah, exactly. And so that's the thing. It's just. But either way, there was that statistic that says 84%. Was a survey based, and they said, basically asked what your main reason for quitting a vegan vegetarian diet was, and the most common response was their health had suffered.
That's not true
and
either.
So that was in that study.
In the Phonalytics, it was not.
Survey?
No, it was not in the So it was
enough.
actually
Anyway, so there was just so much wrong with what you said that I just had to go into every single topic. But anyway.
And I've seen people with Crohn's, ulcerative colitis, rheumatoid arthritis, MS, they all improve going on a meat-only diet. And a lot of them were plant-based. And so I don't think that it's just getting away from processed foods. There is a benefit to eating meat, and seemingly from reducing other things. And we can get into that when we talk about the whole, plants are trying to kill you thing. But yeah, you were going to say.
Yeah. So, I mean, look, we can look at anecdotes on either side. I mean, we see Paul Saladino started introducing plants after he didn't feel so good. Frank Tufano's off the carnivore diet and disparages the carnivore diet at this point. We have the carnivore kid. He had a scan, found out he had, a lot of coronary artery blockage. I can't remember the exact percentage. You look at, for anybody watching this, go to Carnivore Cringe on Instagram and just look through all the posts of people struggling on the carnivore diet. Anecdotes are unreliable. We can point in any direction we want. We can look at Mark Hubb, the researcher from Kansas State University, went on the Twinkie diet. It was Twinkie and sweets, basically, like 80% of his diet, lost weight, improved biomarkers, felt better. Of course, weight loss is going to help. And it's an elimination diet, just like a carnivore diet could be as well, and just like a plant-based diet could be as well, in either direction. These anecdotes don't tell us a lot. You can't control for other variables. You can't adjust for them properly. That's why looking at prospective cohorts that are well adjusted, like a couple that I've mentioned so far, are beneficial. Now, I do want to just mention, you said you were bringing up a study about vegetarians doing worse. I was wondering if you can bring that up.
Yeah.
Actually, another anecdote that's always a funny one is Freddie Blum was like the oldest person in the world. He actually died a few years ago at like 120 or something, but he smoked every day. It's like, you can find anecdotes for anything. So just, not super reliable and don't really tell us much. So, yeah, for vitamin K2, are you familiar with the different types, MK7, MK4?
No, not particularly.
Okay, so MK7 is, so we produce both of these in our body. We convert K1, also the microbes in our gut produce some. So MK4 is the predominant type in animal foods, in meat, in cheeses, and whatnot. And we actually don't absorb it at dietary doses. So let's pop this open here. We've been consuming a fair amount. We have the MK4 at 420 micrograms. We have MK7 at 420 micrograms. The MK4 that is present in food does not contribute to vitamin K status. It didn't actually increase blood levels. And in order to absorb it, we need very, very high doses that are achieved pretty much exclusively through supplementation. MK7, on the other hand, is the type we find in natto, which is fermented soy, and we can actually absorb it from there. Now, it's not an essential nutrient because we do convert K1. Like I said, the microbes in our gut produce some K2, but this idea that we're getting K2 from meat just doesn't follow because we don't even absorb it at those doses.
You were wrong about many other things as well.
Now, on top of that, just talking about vitamin A really quick. So we look at the conversion of beta carotene to vitamin A. It's just taking a minute to load. So if we look at fruits, green vegetables, let's take sweet potatoes. They're kind of right in the middle. In fact, I will take the most conservative estimate of a 13-to-1 conversion ratio. If you have 60% impairment, so most people who have impaired vitamin A synthesis or beta carotene conversion, they have about a 55 to 70% impairment of conversion. To make enough vitamin A, all you'd have to do, if you had 60% impairment, let's say, is to eat literally 1 cup of mashed sweet potatoes in a day. Forget about all the other food you ate and you've got enough vitamin A. If you had 80% conversion or impairment of conversion, you're talking about 2 cups of sweet potatoes in a day to meet your needs. It's nothing. It's so easy. And this goes back to the data I showed earlier looking at actual tissue levels and deficiency rates of these nutrients. We don't see higher rates of vitamin A deficiency amongst vegans. And if there was this crazy issue with us converting enough carotenoids, surely we would see huge deficiency rates, but we don't.
The two things that you touched on so far, you got wrong.
Absolutely.
My point in saying that was just that I was just pointing out there are other nutritional deficiencies and other sort of problems, and you're pointing out that vitamin A probably isn't one of them. Fine.
Yeah, neither is K2. I would say. Yeah. Neither is K2.
You were wrong about many other things as well.
Based off of what you just expressed, is the diet that you're eating a vegan diet for those that are of the means, or is it for all of humanity? You know what I mean? Like, is it for everyone, or is it for those that have the means? I
don't think any diet is necessarily for, I don't think every carnivore diet is for everyone either. I mean, there are people who live in places that literally rely on more plant foods and what they can grow locally. There's populations, I think I've seen you, Anthony, mention this, people in, Papua New Guinea who live on sweet potatoes largely, or, so I don't think you can say that about any diet.
And you very well.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's the thing is I don't, I don't think you can say that, but that's not necessarily who we're reaching here, right?
So this was something on animal proteins versus plant proteins, so essential amino acids. Animal proteins supply essential amino acids more effectively than plant proteins due to their amino acid composition and high digestibility.
This
Two or
seems
more
like a
plant
different
proteins
topic.
can be consumed together. No. What I was saying
Okay.
was I'm going back to show you all the different things that I had referenced because you had asked me to.
I see.
So I'm just going to go through those real quick.
Okay.
Yeah. Can be consumed together to provide amino acid adequacy, but low digestibility remains a major problem with substantial impacts on human health and development, particularly for infants and young children. There's an urgent need for technologies to improve plant protein nutrition, e.g. through selective plant breeding or genetic modification, fortification with EAAs, or processing approaches that increase digestibility by addressing structural barriers in amino acid bioavailability and accessibility.
Yeah. So for the protein digestibility part, assuming was that measured with the DAS or the PDCAS as far as digestibility, do you know?
No, let me look that up, sorry.
Yeah.
But you don't know how to read a forest plot.
Sorry, go on.
Yeah. So as far as the it's most likely one of those two, unless you say otherwise. I'll assume it's one of those two scoring systems because those are the most often used. So they are basically based on feeding individual foods to typically rodents or pigs, seeing how much goes in one end, how much comes out the other end as far as the protein, and presumably you've absorbed the amount that is the difference. With pigs, it's up until the end of the small intestine, or with the DAS rather, it's up until the end of the small intestine. They then actually modify the scores based on what amino acid is present in the lowest amount. And now, if you're eating a single food diet, I would say yes, that's a problem. But if you're eating a variety of foods or you're exceeding your protein needs, at least as far as the RDA, I do suggest higher though, then that is no longer a problem. It compensates. But more than any of that, what we ultimately need to look at are outcomes. So what actually happens when you pit vegans against meat eaters and you equate their protein intake? So there was a study done in Brazil in it was published in 2021. This is Hevia Lorraine is the author. The senior author was Hamilton Rochelle. And they found that when both groups are eating 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per day, and they're performing resistance training, you get the same results at the end of the day, same muscle and strength gains. So there are clearly issues with using those measures of digestibility, or really any measure of digestibility if it was something else, because the outcomes are the same. What I care about is, do you get the same result? There was also a more recent study. This one was looking at mycoprotein, and they had them eat either most of their protein from the mycoprotein or most of their protein from animal protein sources, upping it to above that 1.6 grams per kilogram per day. And again, they got the same result at the end of resistance training 5 times a week for 10 weeks.
And it found that correcting for socioeconomic factors, that meat was a positive factor on life expectancy. So that was a positive.
Now, as far as the total meat intake and across countries, that cross-sectional study, there are some major issues with that. So I'm just gonna pull up something here as well. So it was cross-sectional for starters. That's one issue. And they didn't actually look at dietary intake. Are you familiar with how they tracked meat intake?
I'd have to look at it, but no, go on.
But you don't know how to read a forest plot.
Yeah, so they actually didn't track meat intake. They tracked food, like meat supply data from each country, and didn't even use the loss adjusted numbers, which is bizarre. You should at least use that. So that's one problem. It's not a very good, and I know you said it's not a great study anyway, but I'm just saying it's actually much poorer than the data I've cited on meat intake in particular. Where you're tracking it at the individual level. Secondly, they didn't really adjust for socioeconomic status. They actually adjusted for GDP, which can bias the results, because during times of rapid growth, mortality can increase, for example. So that's one issue with using GDP. And secondly, it doesn't tell us what proportions of the populations are of higher socioeconomic status or not. It's a very kind of gross estimate of that. And if we look at, say, smoking rates across populations, per capita cigarette consumption across populations and life expectancy suggests that countries with higher cigarette consumption actually have greater life expectancy too. That's why it's bizarre to do these cross-country analyses. What is far better is looking within populations, different levels of meat intake, and seeing if those who eat more have a higher or lower risk of things like mortality than those who eat less, while adjusting for confounding variables. The reason I like the nurses' health study and health professionals' follow-up study in particular so much is because you're comparing nurses to nurses, doctors to doctors, and you're adjusting for smoking, physical activity, BMI, one of the more comprehensive adjustment models that we have. And they repeat dietary intakes, which is awesome. Every 4 years they collect diet data versus a lot of studies where they only collect it once and then they don't later on. And now that last study, the one on you mentioned it was a cross-sectional study of vegetarians. Again, cross-sectional is definitely much lower on the evidence hierarchy related to actually seeing a temporal component. Looking at mental health, for example, when you actually stratify by semi-vegetarian, lacto-ovo-vegetarian, vegan, vegans actually aren't at higher risk, or vegan diets aren't associated with significant increase in risk of depression or anxiety. If anything, there might even be a slight decrease.
I've already pointed out 3 of the things that you got wrong out of the 5. And you are the one that is recommending, telling people what to eat.
So are you pulling something else up?
Yeah, so I'm pulling up. So this is a table of the different oxalate content in different plants, and so rhubarb and spinach obviously having high numbers of these sorts of things, but other things as well. And that's per 100 grams. And
that's a lot.
Sure. Yeah.
Like you'd have to eat an insane amount to run into any issues.
So this looked at 2 African populations, the Maasai and the Akikuyu, who are genetically similar because they interbreed, but they also have very, very different nutritional components to their diet. So the Akikuyu are largely vegetarian. They eat some meat, but largely cereals and grains, and the women would eat more greens. And the Maasai would eat quite a lot of milk and meat and blood, especially the hunter class. The warrior class, and they found a lot of physical disparities between the two. So physical measurements of the full-grown Maasai male belonging to the carnivorous tribe, and as far as muscular strength, it was determined by diameter to be 50% stronger in the male Maasai versus Akikuyu, and in fact, the Akikuyu males were only slightly stronger than the female Akikuyu, and were equivalent to the female Maasai. They also had marked differences such as greater incidence of bone deformities, dental caries, anemia, pulmonary conditions, tropical ulcers among the vegetarian tribes.
So, going back to that study you just mentioned. Now, for starters, I think there's sort of a lack of relevance to really our discussion here, in that the diet that they were on was pretty well exclusively, was 85% corn, millet, and sweet potatoes. It's not the diet I'm advocating for. Their calcium intake was in the gutter. At the same time, you did mention that, or I should mention here that they write in the paper that at present stage we do not feel justified in attempting a detailed discussion of the results obtained or in attempting to draw definite conclusions therefrom. And that's largely because, as you said, this is not of the highest quality.
We haven't had, and we also don't have isolated incidents with just vegan, with just carnivore, without processed foods. It does not exist. And so that.
But we do. We have studies evaluating that. But we have studies evaluating that.
For the last 100 years? No.
I mean, we have 20, 30, 40-year follow-ups in lifelong vegans, a large chunk of the AHS cohort.
We don't have that to compare in a lot of ways with carnivore and other things. So the comparison between the two, if you're going to argue, is yes, the studies are inherently flawed, and also the intentions behind those who are putting on the studies could be flawed. And then also, the factors of processed food coming in is a huge factor. We can't control for that.
But we can. And in the context of this so-called standard American diet, if you replace just some of the red meat with just some of the plant protein and the rest is kept equal, as far as lifestyle and diet, we see improvements, right? So what is ultimately being suggested here is that, oh yeah, these swaps in the context of a less healthy diet, you swap meat for plants is beneficial, but all of a sudden if you go to all meat, it's beneficial versus that swap slightly towards more plants. It doesn't make any sense. That you're talking about a curve that goes like this or something, or actually the other way.
But what that suggests is, again, experiment is what trumps all. If it doesn't agree with the experiment, it's wrong. And so I haven't gone through that study you're referencing, so I don't know the specific sort of ins and outs of it, so I can't critique it at the moment. But what I can tell you is that if you are doing something and it gets the exact opposite results of what any study suggests, then that study is wrong. Or there's some sort of flaw in it.
If I put people on smoking. But if I told people to start smoking and they lost weight, they felt better, they had mental clarity, is that a good thing?
Yeah, but that's not what I'm saying.
No, I know that's not what you're saying. I'm saying that
arthritis and MS.
Okay, so here, this is good.
So I'm gonna
but this is really good. Parkinson's disease, ulcerative colitis, smoking actually helps in those cases. So if I put someone on, someone started smoking,
it's literally everything. It's literally everything.
You can't
I have
make
patients
that
whose CAC score goes down after a year of being on a carnivore diet. And I have patients whose insulin resistance goes down and their leptin goes down and their CRP goes down.
These are just I can say the same thing about a vegan diet. I can say the exact same thing about a vegan diet.
But what I'm saying is that when you put someone on an exclusively meat diet, they get better. So your study that says...
Well, compared to garbage, maybe. Compared to garbage, maybe.
No. You're assuming that only people improving are the ones that are coming from a processed food diet. That is not the case. There is thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of people who are coming from a plant-based diet, a whole food diet, or a whole food omnivorous diet that are seeing massive improvements in their health. It is not just a processed food diet going to a carnivore diet. That does exist.
And
that's not.
We're seeing harm as well. We're seeing a lot of harm as well. Carnivore cringe, like I said, anyone look that up on Instagram. I've had people message me. I've had people message me saying, "Hey, I tried carnivore, was terrible. I went, vegan, better than I've ever been." We can play the anecdote game back and forth. What matters is when we actually look at
when you fix it. Like you said, the Akikuyu don't count. That they didn't do your style of vegan diet. That's fine. I have a lot of people who message me as well and saying they are having problems, and I work with them and I troubleshoot for them, and then they improve and they get better. I have yet to see someone come to me with problems and not be able to figure it out with them, not a single time.
And we can play the anecdote game back and forth. It doesn't tell us anything. These aren't verified.
Not an anecdote game.
No, but
this
is
real life. This is experiment.
And anecdotes, they are anecdotes. They are actually by definition anecdotes.
Yes.
But also, I don't think there was any critiques. Now I know Anthony mentioned that he needs to brush up on these studies in order to critique them, and I'm happy to come back for a part 2 so we can have that chat. Thus far, as far as substitution analyses, there have been no critiques as far as the long-term RCT in the form of the Leon diet heart, suggesting that replacing animal foods with plant foods, leading to about a 70% reduction in mortality. There has been no critique. And as far as anecdotes, like, look, we can tell people to smoke and they improve Parkinson's disease, ulcerative colitis risk. It doesn't mean that it's good long-term. These patients haven't been followed long-term to see if they've developed diseases that take 40, 50, 60 years to occur. And that's what I'm worried about, is that people are going to adopt these sorts of dietary practices and run into issues way down the line, like I've shown, even in those ancestral populations. Inuit mummies from 500 years ago, mummies from Egypt 4,000 years ago, mummies from Lithuania 300-400 years ago. We see that they do develop atherosclerosis, and it can be quite extensive. So even if we look at those cultures presumably following those dietary practices, still not a good thing long term.
So I would just say that the reason I don't really pay too much heed to these studies is because they aren't great, and so we don't. So studies on my side or your side or whatever, they're not great, and so they're not proving anybody one way or the other. And we have a number of conflicting points of evidence. So that's why I think you need to go to our biological nature, what we are designed to eat. I don't think that you've made a cogent argument on why that's okay to not eat what we're designed to eat. And
with regard to biological adaptations, I mean, we have adaptations to carbohydrates. We have 10 to 20 times the amylase gene that our Neanderthal cousins do, for example. But at the end of the day, I don't see why having adaptations to a certain food or a certain dietary practice means that it's best for us long term. And to understand that, let's just talk a little bit about how natural selection works, right? We all have genes. We pass down our genes to our offspring, our children, and those who reproduce more are going to end up spreading their genes more. And throughout evolution, genes that help us get to that point of reproducing are the ones that are passed on. Genes that don't necessarily help us get to that point eventually get weeded out of the population. A great example of this not necessarily leading to good long-term health is sickle cell anemia. So if we look at areas where malaria is endemic, sickle cell anemia actually helps protect against malaria. So kids won't die at very young ages due to malaria infections, but they can run into complications long term, like cardiovascular complications beyond the reproductive window. And so there's no good reason, in my view, to think that even if we had adaptations to eating meat, that it's necessarily going to lead to good long-term health. And what I ultimately care about are those long-term health outcomes. And just to highlight some of the data on that, I mean, we have food groups and the risk of all-cause mortality. We see that whole grain consumption, higher whole grain consumption, lower risk. Refined grains, not so much. I don't advocate for that. Vegetable consumption, higher intake, lower risk. Fruit consumption, nut consumption, legume consumption. Whereas on the flip side, eggs, dairy, red meat, processed meat, and sugar-sweetened beverages. Of course, I don't advocate for that. If we look at long-term randomized controlled trials in the form of the Lyon Diet Heart Study, the main dietary changes, the statistically significant changes, were more bread, more fruit, and of course the bread was mostly whole wheat in this case, more fruit, more margarines, less butter and cream, less meat, and less delicatessen, which is like meat and cheeses, and a 70% lower risk of all-cause mortality. I see that's really small. It says 0.3 right there. And so when we're looking at the long-term health outcomes amongst people actually living today, and following them over time, we see consistently that they end up doing better the more plant foods, at least those healthier plant foods I highlighted, not so much the refined grains and Coca-Colas.
But you don't know how to read a forest plot.
Dude.
Fuck off, I don't want anything to do with you. Don't ever speak to me again. You're a fucking piece of shit.
Even vegans don't get your weird, stupid wannabe sense of irony here. Who's your audience? Nobody gets these dumb jokes. Dude,